This is the 17th year for the Art Harvest Studio Tour of Yamhill County. The tour, which is the first 2 weekends in October, is a great opportunity to talk to artists. Visiting an artist's studio can be a fascinating experience. We visited with Claire Carver, a painter in the Gaston area who farms with horses. Her farm is down a country lane, and her studio is a historic farmhouse.
So 2009 was my first year on the tour, and it was fabulous. I didn't know what to expect. I was like, oh gosh, you know, who's gonna come all the way out here to the middle of nowhere? And people really came, and a lot of people came from Portland. People were just really excited to see the space. People enjoyed seeing the house. I did open studios in the Napa Valley, and I did open studios in San Francisco. I found here people very much did come for the destination as well as the art, and I hadn't experienced that in the past, where in the past people came to my studio primarily for the art because I lived in town, both in Napa and in San Francisco, and it was just another house like anybody else's house, and that happened to be where my studio was. So this is fun because it's a little more dynamic, and people are like, oh, you know, interested in the space, and I enjoy sharing that because we work really hard on this farm, and it's all part of my life. You can't pull the two apart. You can't take the art, creating the art, away from the fact that I'm farming, the fact that I'm farming with horses. I mean, I haven't done any paintings yet of the horses, but I'm sure they're coming. And so I think people really enjoy that. And I enjoy sharing that when people came out to this particular art harvest. Yeah, it's really inspiring to live here. I mean, obviously, I have 100 chickens, and so they're around all the time, and I love painting them because they're just, every time they move, they make a new little drawing, and they're so expressive and doing things. And you can paint a chicken in almost any way, and it still looks very chicken-y. They're a lot of fun to paint. I think people have found the chicken paintings really appealing because there's a lot of new chicken owners out there. So while this chicken might be a white chicken, there's very little white in this painting. This is probably the only bits of white that are in the painting at all, yet this chicken, you can tell, is white. And there's all this great color in her shadow. These really hot blues, quite a bit of yellow in here and orange. And that's an example of the color that you're observing as opposed to the color that the thing is. And that's, it's a pretty easy trap to fall into, where it's a green truck, so I'm going to paint it green. The only time that you see that color green is where the sunlight is directly hitting that object. Then you have everything that's in shadow, or where the sun's hitting it and it changes the color into something very hot. So doing that type of observation is something that I really honed in painting plein air, and it transfers when you're not. Like, these paintings are not plein air. I go out and I take pictures and do sketches of the chickens, and then I come back into the studio and do these paintings because chickens move way too fast to paint them plein air. But that same practice translates really readily into the studio. So they're just quick paintings, and really it's just a way to practice. It's like practicing an instrument. I look at still lifes that way. It's just a way to sort of observe, create compositions, and keep your chops up so that when you go out in the spring, you're ready to hit the ground running. I did go to art school. I actually went to several art schools. I was very lucky in that my father was an artist, and he, professionally, he was an industrial designer. But he recognized that I could draw. So he gave me private art lessons from a very young age. And I continued those through high school, and then I did go to art school for college. But I actually focused in graphic design. I didn't focus in painting because I probably, in following my father, it was like, well, I have to have a career because you can't make a living as an artist, which is crazy. You totally can. Although I still do practice graphic design as well as my painting. I design wine labels, which is really a lot of fun, and I don't really want to give it up because I frequently do create fine art for the labels that I do. even we have our own wine brand, and I've drawn all the labels for ours, and each year I do a new label design for our vintages, which is a lot of fun. I actually have quite a few pre-made colors on my palette. I do mix a lot of my own color as well. For people starting out for painting, I recommend just starting with a really basic palette. But once you sort of really start to know your colors and know sort of what you're after, it just, quite frankly, takes some of the work out of it. There's just a few colors that I like. There's some of these beautiful blues that I like in my shadows. This is called a King's Blue, and it's a pretty easy blue. It's just cobalt and white essentially, but when you have it right out of the tube like that, it just makes it so that I can put it down and not really worry about it. I have it right there accessible to me. A lot of my paintings are small because when you're painting plein air, if you have a painting this big, the wind's going to take it away and you're not going to finish. Because really with a true plein air painting, unless you plan on going back to the same spot the next day and the weather's going to change, forget it. I mean, for me at least, it's a one sitting painting. And after 2 to 3 hours, depending on the time of year, the light's going to change and everything in your painting just changed. I mean, going back to talking about this chicken, the sunlight's over here. As soon as the sun's here, which happens in about 2 hours, that blue shadow isn't even there anymore. So the whole painting changes, and that's, you know, very applicable in a landscape. So I paint typically from, 12 inches up to about 14 inches for a plein air landscape, because that's all I can get done in that period of time. I typically paint on these masonite panels, which I gesso them and then I prime them in this red color. And the red's fairly unusual. A lot of artists do prime in a color, but it's usually a neutral. It's like a gray or sometimes a warmish pink color. I just happen to love high key color, and the bright red sort of pumps up the whole palette when I'm working. You'll notice in my work it's all pretty high key, very bright, and the red tends to start that process off in a hurry, especially when you're painting plein air. So I do paint some larger pieces in my studio, and they're typically on canvas. Like this painting here, that's on canvas. As soon as you sort of get beyond a certain size, the board isn't as stable, and I typically don't cut a board bigger than 16 inches, because then things could start to happen to the board unless you plan on mounting it in a particular way. And also, the way that you're working with a brush on a board has a certain feel to it, and it gives itself to a certain size brushstroke. This is sort of hard to explain, but once you move to a canvas, you're using a bigger brush. The brush the canvas has more give, so it's almost like a whole different style of painting in terms of the brush stroke. You can kind of see it in this painting. So in the larger painting, I mean, even in this large background, you can see these big strokes that have a lot of movement to them, and that's because this canvas moves when I push on it with the brush. So I get this big active stroke with the brush, with these large pieces here. While in this background here, they're actually more sort of hash mark strokes that don't quite they're just different. They're a little tighter, it's a smaller brush, they just have a different feel. A really good example of that is actually the painting that's in the other room. It's a large, more abstract painting of a hay bale that has some really big, sort of watery brush strokes in it that you get with canvas. I think seeing your art as a business, one of the sort of entry points of that is taking yourself seriously. Always paint, always work on your art, but if you need to do other things to support your art, do those things, but just always come back to your art. Always know that your art is what you're supposed to be doing and what these other things are feeding into.
Next, we visited Dwight Ewald in Carleton. Dwight studied art in Chicago, New York, and Italy. He's a sculptor and a painter.
I like to watch what happens when the things that are have patterns and are orderly, and the things that are random come together. I started messing around with plastic pipes because I wanted to find a material that didn't have a lot of references to it, in art. You know, there was not a lot of kind of baggage with it. So some of the sculptures that I make are like things of wire or that are just really simple shapes, but they're also meant to have that sort of organicness that nature has as well. I like the way that the raku works with a lot of things because it's so organic and so out of control to a certain extent. And it works really well with these really highly figured pieces of wood, which these are. When I'm working with the materials that just kind of hold themselves together that need to be carved, so this is a subtractive process, but I'm really thinking in terms of those ideas of modernism and also of my other ideas of the interrelationship of randomness and order. So depending on the shape of the wood, you know, or the shape of the stone, that's going to help you determine what you're going to make. There's a certain amount of deliberateness in art. It's happening on purpose. It's happening because you wanted it to. And it's kind of what I do when I approach wood carving is I look at the piece of wood and think, you know, how can this work for me to do what I want it to do? These are all, some of these pieces of wood that are shaped like this are from what I think used to be rifle stock blanks. Sometimes ideas from culture come into what you're doing too. These came about just by working with some pinch pots and just deciding, well, I want to do this kind of random globular thing. I was thinking that'd be kind of cool. But they also have this kind of look to them, like they could be almost like polyps of some kind, or they even vaguely remind people of a figure, and a particular figure that if you took art history class, there's this Venus of Willendorf figure, okay? And so it has that reference. So any sculpture that's about the size of a person makes you think of a person, and you relate it to your own size and your own physicality. And, that's part of the way that you get content into artwork, is by recognizing that if it looks like a figure, it's going to make those references, and you have to deal with those references. So a lot of times I'll be using patterns in a really kind of expressionistic way, or paint in a really expressionistic way. Just that thing just evolved. You know, it evolved out of a grid that was underneath, and then just by keeping painting and painting and painting and letting certain references come in that I saw, you know, sometimes something looks like a plant, sometimes something looks like, you know, circulatory system, or sometimes something looks like, you know, the sky or whatever. Those things sort of come into the paintings. And then there's also a group of paintings that I really allow random things to happen, and I kind of let things happen. Like a painting like this one, it's not so much poured on as it is set out, you know, and then tipped every now and then to let the paint move around. In this case, this is just set outside to let the needles fall onto it and stick. This is just something I just did the other day, and I'm not sure if it's done yet. That's called a solar painting. Actually, it's photosensitive emulsion on the canvas, and then it's set out in the sun with objects over it, and then washed out. So the imprint is actually of things that were placed on the surface of the canvas, and so it creates those effects. I have some ideas about what things could mean, but it's not necessarily what they have to mean. I feel like art is a really hard thing to do, for one thing, in terms of really dedicating yourself to it, and for me it seems like half measures just aren't working. You know, half measures won't do. You have to actually go at it with everything. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. That's what I'm going to start. That's what I'm doing.
The way it works is you get a map, a catalog, buy a ticket, and you get to see all 40 artists. All you need to know is on the website.